All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the sheer, unprecedented paradoxes, both military and economic, of the 2026 US-Israel-Iran war. This really isn't just some localized conflict anymore. We're looking at a profound shift in modern warfare, one that's literally reshaping the global economy, completely scrambling supply chains, and seriously testing the absolute limits of traditional military dominance.
So here's the massive question we really need to wrap our heads around. When a military completely dominates the battlefield, why on earth isn't it winning the war? That's the central paradox we're exploring today. We're taking a completely impartial look at how immense conventional superiority, situations where one side completely controls the skies and the initial strike capability, just hasn't led to a swift victory. It's a fascinating, if sobering look at how the whole definition of winning has completely fractured in 2026.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the unwon war. Second, Iran's mosaic defense. Third, Gulf nations, crisis and solutions. Fourth, global shockwaves and Asia. And finally, the trillion-dollar price. We'll be shifting from the tactical military doctrines right on the ground all the way to the massive macroeconomic shocks felt everywhere from the Gulf to India.
Part 1. The unwon war. We're going to start by looking at the opening stages of Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, which were launched by the US and Israel in February 2026.
The clashing strategies here are honestly pretty stark. On one hand, you've got the US and Israeli doctrine. This is all about rapid dominance, right? Precision targeting, leadership decapitation. Basically the idea that if you eliminate the top leadership and destroy key infrastructure, the enemy's system will simply collapse. But then look at the Iranian doctrine. It's the exact opposite. We see preparation for a long, grinding endurance test. They built a system specifically assuming they would take massive initial damage.
Now look at the impact of that first week. By any traditional metric, the US and Israel delivered a devastating blow. A 90% drop in Iranian traditional missile launches, a 90% loss of their naval capabilities, plus over 250 senior leaders taken out. On paper, that's game over. Yet, the Iranian system did not collapse. The war didn't end.
Well, that brings us to part 2, Iran's mosaic defense. To understand how they actually survived that incredible initial shock, we have to look at a doctrine Tehran spent the last 20 years building.
The key thing to grasp here is that Iranian military planners assumed from day one that they would lose their central leadership and communications. They knew the capital would go dark. So, what did they do? They built this decentralized mosaic defense. Think of it like a giant puzzle. They structured their military into semi-independent regional pieces. If central command is destroyed, local commanders already have the authority and the stockpiles to just keep fighting. They essentially turned time itself into a weapon against a much superior conventional force.
And, this wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was directly inspired by watching their neighbors. Listen to this quote from Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. "We've had 2 decades to study defeats of the U.S. military to our immediate east and west. Bombings in our capital have no impact on our ability to conduct war." They literally sat back, watched highly centralized systems in Iraq and Afghanistan crumble quickly, and decided they needed to aggressively diffuse their power to absorb that kind of overwhelming technological superiority.
So how does this actually play out on the ground? It's basically a 3-step survival mechanism. Step 1, the regular army, the Artesh, absorbs the absolute brunt of those high-tech airstrikes. Step 2, the Revolutionary Guard and local Basij units kick off decentralized attrition warfare, ambushes and drone strikes that completely bypass the need for central command. And then step 3, and this is the real pivot, they shift the pain outward by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, imposing immediate and unbearable costs on the global economy.
And just think about the sheer level of redundancy required for this next concept. They call it the fourth successor. To avoid the kind of systemic paralysis that usually follows decapitation strikes, Iran instituted up to 4 pre-designated layers of replacements for every single key military and civilian post. This ensures that the death of a leader, even at the absolute highest levels, doesn't stop the machinery of the state from functioning.
Part 3. Gulf Nations, Crisis and Solutions. Now, because Iran pushed the conflict's center of gravity outward, their immediate neighbors suddenly found themselves plunged into a severe existential crisis.
This created what economists are calling the Hormuz paradox, and it's a brutal catch-22.
With the Strait of Hormuz closed, you've got 13 million barrels of oil trapped every single day. Sure, oil prices surged way past $120 a barrel, which normally means a massive financial windfall, but the Gulf producers can't actually export it, so their revenue is completely cut off. Right at the exact same moment, their import costs for food have skyrocketed. Add to this the targeting of desalination plants, which supply 99% of drinking water in places like Qatar and Kuwait, and that long-standing narrative of the Gulf as a permanently safe economic haven, it's been completely shattered.
The economic damage here is just staggering. Take Qatar, for instance. Because of the blockade, their entire liquefied natural gas export capacity is just stranded. We're looking at a projected 9% drop in their GDP, and the wider Gulf region is staring down an average 6.2% economic contraction.
So how do you overcome something like that? Faced with potential systemic collapse, some Gulf nations are finding solutions totally outside of military escalation. Look at this massive figure, $10 billion. That represents the diplomatic solution the UAE agreed to release to Iran. By unfreezing these funds, the UAE essentially bought a halt to Iranian missile and drone attacks on their own soil. It really illustrates how regional powers are being forced to use immense financial leverage just to buy stability and protect their fragile infrastructure.
Which leads us directly into Part 4, Global Shockwaves in Asia. Because, as we know, the economic fallout definitely didn't stay confined to the Middle East. It violently rippled outward, hitting global supply chains with a particularly heavy blow to Asia.
Look at how fast this cascaded across the continent. The view from India's perspective is especially fascinating. Technically, India actually had sufficient physical fuel reserves, but the sheer psychological shockwave of the war, it triggered massive, man-made panic buying and fuel hoarding across the entire country. And then look at the future for Central Asia. It looks incredibly precarious right now. Their airspace and crucial land trade routes are completely paralyzed, which is being made even worse by a simultaneous conflict erupting between Afghanistan and Pakistan. From states of emergency in the Philippines to physical fuel pumps running completely dry in Vietnam and Bangladesh, the disruption is absolute.
This brilliantly illustrates how a localized maritime blockade creates an unavoidable crisis for everyone else. It's not just about oil. The Gulf supplies 45% of global sulfur, which is essential for fertilizer. So suddenly you've got a massive food crisis ticking like a delayed time bomb for South Asia and East Africa. Oh, and 40% of the world's helium is trapped in Qatar right now, creating a catastrophic bottleneck in global semiconductor and technology manufacturing. The whole system is connected.
Part 5. The trillion-dollar price. Finally, let's take a step back and really quantify the macroeconomic toll this conflict is exacting on the world.
This number right here is an absolute silent killer for the developing world. $88 billion. That's the amount of annual remittances sent home by Gulf workers. With the Gulf economy contracting, that critical stream of income is seriously threatened. And again, from India's perspective, alongside places like Pakistan and Egypt, the sudden loss of these funds is dealing a devastating direct blow, pushing already fragile economies right to the brink of sovereign debt defaults.
According to the 2026 Global Peace Index, the global economy is staring down a catastrophic loss of output. Right now, in this fragile stalemate scenario, it's costing the world about $1.3 trillion this year. But if that ceasefire breaks and the war resumes at full scale, that economic crater expands to $3.5 trillion. To put that into perspective, that surpasses the initial economic shock of the entire Russia-Ukraine war. Now, the pain is definitely distributed differently depending on where you look. Over in Europe, the sudden lack of Qatari gas has doubled benchmarks to 60 euros per megawatt hour. That's pushing industrial powerhouses like Germany towards severe stagflation and potential deindustrialization. But for developing nations, it's not about industry. It's literally about immediate survival. Surging energy costs are driving up basic food distribution by up to 5%. Pushing highly indebted nations toward total financial collapse.
Which brings us to $2.2 trillion. That staggering number is what economists are now calling the dollar value of diplomacy. It represents the literal global economic savings, the exact difference in GDP loss, if a permanent ceasefire is achieved instead of allowing the war to resume. It quite literally puts a massive price tag on the absolute necessity of peace in an interconnected world.
It's such a profound paradox to consider, isn't it? As warfare evolves away from decisive battlefield victories and more towards devastating global economic attrition, can our interconnected world even survive the true cost of modern conflict? We've just seen how a militarily outmatched nation can use time, decentralization, and global economic choke points to effectively stall a superior force, sending shockwaves everywhere from the factories of Europe to the fuel pumps of India. It's a lot to digest. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.